Watching Cole Harrison work hard here, letting people in. Okay, well, we've hit 100 people in so far, with more to come. So let me get my screen properly set here and say good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And welcome on behalf of Massachusetts Peace Action and a campaign for peace, disarmament, and common security. My name is Joseph Gerson, and it's my privilege to be chairing this afternoon's webinar, what it will take to get a Russian and Ukrainian ceasefire and negotiations. Well, I'm sure that there must be disagreements among us here. With hundreds of thousands dead and wounded and its devastation, the Ukraine war desperately needs to be brought to an end, and the killing ended as soon and as justly as possible. Peace and anti-war movements around the world have called for a ceasefire and negotiations. Pope Francis, President Lula of Brazil have echoed that call. China has called for a ceasefire and put forward its position on political settlement of the war, including an insistence that there be no resort to the use of nuclear weapons. Turkey and Israel have attempted to mediate the conflict, and in the last weeks or so, Prime Minister Scholz, President Macron, and Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, have traveled to Beijing, among other things, to explore the possibility of peace negotiations. Yet with their mutually exclusive demands, Putin and Zelensky have not sent their mandarins to the negotiating table. And while the Biden administration is reportedly sending signals that the current levels of U.S. military and financial support for Kiev cannot be maintained, it has done nothing publicly to get the warring parties to the table. And sadly, tragically, we expect intensified fighting and destruction in the coming weeks as each side seeks to gain territory and leverage. The need to stop the killing and to prevent possible escalation of the war could not be greater. But with the few exceptions of white supremacist Christian nationalists, we are not hearing critical voices about the war in Washington. And our peace and anti-war movements here in the United States, despite our best efforts, are struggling to gain political traction. Fortunately, in addition to the political leaders I mentioned earlier, in Europe, popular movements are pushing hard from below. We can learn from them and find ways to collaborate with them, including the June 10 and 11 Vienna Peace Summit and the Peace in Ukraine and Roots Action Coalition signature campaigns, which will be among the initiatives discussed today. Before turning to our speakers, a few logistical items. Reiner Braun, Lula of Brazil, and Phyllis Bennis will begin with opening remarks about the war, their government's policies and perspectives, where they see openings to get to a ceasefire and negotiations, and their movement's initiatives. They'll each do all of that in about 7 to 10 minutes. They'll then have time to question one another, and I might toss in a question or two before we begin your questions. With the Zoom system that we're using, we don't have a Q&A box. And so I need to ask people in the webinar here to take pity on your MC here, to place your questions in the chat box, but please restrain yourself from making additional comments, because I'm going to have to sort through them to find the questions, and that may not be happy for everybody else. Then to say, I'm happy to be introducing 3 friends and leading European and U.S. peace movement figures who I've been privileged to work with for many years. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. Reiner Braun is former executive director and president of the International Peace Bureau. He began in the peace movement in 1982, working with the Krefeld Appeal against nuclear weapons. He is a founding member of the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility, and served as executive director of the German section of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. He has recently returned from Moscow, where he met with members of the Russian elite and war opponents, and he is the leading organizer of the June 10 and 11 Vienna Peace Summit. Lula of Brazil is a Belgian writer and spokesman for the Belgian peace organization Vrede VZW, and a member of the No to War NATO steering committee. He writes opinion pieces for Vrede Utepers. I'm just going to mangle the Dutch, so please excuse me. Phyllis Bennis directs the new International Project at the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, where she focuses on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and UN issues. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, and her books include Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. So with that introduction made, the welcome, 156 people having joined us, let me turn the floor over to Reiner.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and welcome all of you. You know, it is really difficult to speak to this topic because really no one knows what will be the future of the war. We see that we are in front of the so-called spring offensives of both sides, which again will kill thousands, even 10,000 of people. And I'm in doubt that we can stop the war before these military offensives. But I will come with 3 or 4 suggestions. My first point, and this goes back to the activities in Europe in the last weeks and months. We had the huge demonstration in Italy in January with more than 100,000 people in Rome. We had the youth manifestations in Berlin and Munich, with in Berlin 50,000 and in Munich with 20,000 people. And I think our first job as peace activists and peace movement is to develop and enlarge the activities on the streets. We need more people mobilizing against the war for ceasefire and negotiations. And we were launching over the weekend an international appeal from trade unions, leaders, social democrats, and scientists. And this got an intensive attention in all mass media, including the conservative one. And the reports were by 95% without hate. This shows there is a chance for the actions of the peace movement to change the public opinion in the direction of ceasefire and negotiations. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges we as peace movement are facing. And Joseph mentioned this, I think the IPB International Conference in Vienna had the same background to develop more international cooperation activities for ceasefire and negotiations. And this is my first point. My second point is, I have to say it, peace will not come from Europe in the Ukraine. Europe, above all the European Union countries, are really a part of the war machine. So peace and negotiations will come and are coming from outside of Europe by new political countries which are engaging in this war. Mainly, I think, Brazil, China, India, and maybe Indonesia. And maybe even when we don't love it, but maybe with the support of Turkey and even Israel. These are the countries which are really engaging themselves in getting ceasefire and negotiations and the different governments on the table. So I think what we need is a new coalition for peace from parliamentarians, government, and peace movements, working parallel or closely together for peace. And what we have to do as peace movements is to support all activities of the governments which is going in the direction of negotiation and ceasefire, making them public, support them where we can, getting in contact with the parliamentarians and critical opposition people, to that all of them are supporting these ideas to develop a new coalition for peace from governments of the South, international and national peace movements. The third point, I think, is a traditional peace movement's point, is awareness raising and education work. We have to show that there will be no military win in this war, that we have to protest against the media propaganda and to coordinate our activities for convincing more people, showing that peace negotiations and ceasefire is the only way to stop the war and to come or to open the door for a new peace process and a new peace architecture in Europe. And I think even parts of the political elites or the ruling class are seeing that there is no victory in this war. And so we have to combine our efforts with these more realistic parts of the elites in our understanding for a campaign for ceasefire and negotiations. Fourth point, and I think this is for the peace movement a very important point, we have to support all refugees and all consensus objectors of all sides. This includes the refugees coming from Ukraine, but also this includes the consensus objectors from Russia, which up to now is not allowed to come to the European Union. I would summarize my short introduction to say that, and I will definitely quote Einstein in this sense, never believe that your action is not useful and cannot change, even when it is a very difficult situation. I think we have to connect the activities of the peace movements all around the world, and maybe together we have to think to redevelop a day like the 15th of February 2003, where worldwide at the same day, many people at that time, millions of people were demonstrating against the war. Maybe we need a day of action in autumn of this year for ceasefire negotiations where all around the world, peace activists and peace-loving people are protesting against the war and calling for negotiations and ceasefire. Thank you.
Reiner, thank you for that really comprehensive overview, ambitious vision of coalition building, and if you will, so challenges for us, certainly here in the United States, as we try to build unity, both build our movement and unity across that ocean. Ludo, you are up next.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you all for joining us here. Well, I would like to start, I think, to have successful negotiations, all the historical layers, of course, of the war in Ukraine need to be addressed. That's the first, I think. I would like to discuss them first and take a little bit time for that, because I have the impression, also in Belgium, in the peace movement, there is no consensus on what should be addressed. So I think it's important to discuss them and that we understand the root causes of war. Secondly, I would like to share the reasons why a ceasefire and negotiations briefly become an urgent matter. And finally, I think I would like to discuss what I consider important principles for having a negotiation and a solution to this war. So maybe to start with, the narrative as predominantly presented in the mainstream media gives the impression that the war in Ukraine began with the Russian invasion on the 24th of February 2022. And in that, or according to that narrative, the focus is on the military approach. As many weapons and military support as possible, not only to defend Ukraine, but with the ultimate goal of completely capturing the territory conquered by Russia. In Zelensky's last words last autumn, we will definitely liberate the whole of Ukraine, the Crimea included. That is, let's say, the official purpose of on the side of Kiev regime. And according to that narrative, this is also the condition to have peace again. And I think that's, of course, a little bit too simple. The war started with an uprising in the Donbass, as we all know, in 2014 by nationalists of the Russian minority, undoubtedly encouraged by Moscow and triggered after President Yanukovych was ousted from power. But this turned into a war with Ukrainian nationalists and the Kiev government that started an anti-terrorist operation. And this war caused the death of 14,000 people between 2014 and 2021. So the war has a history. The invasion by Russia has an history that dates back at least to 2014, of course, further back. And at the time, Ukraine was politically, culturally, and economically divided country. And so this we have to take into account whatever solution we propose. Undeniably, the Russian intervention, as they intervened in February last year, directly is an irresponsible violation of international law and the sovereignty of a country. I want to be clear about that. That we must condemn this. And Putin also made things worse. Politically, the Russian invasion contributed to the report of NATO, the strengthening of U.S. strategic positions in Europe, and legitimized the arming and militarization of Europe to almost unprecedented levels. The problem with the narrow mainstream views of the war is that they cling to the idea that this war can be won. However, it's likely to evolve into a protracted stalemate, as has been discussed recently in detail by the RAND Corporation, a think tank close, an American think tank close to the Pentagon. And that's, let's say, the scenario of a kind of repeating the World War I war. Another major problem is that mainstream narratives not only ignore the root causes of war, but also Western responsibility. And they stress that the war was not provoked. In reality, NATO does bear great responsibility for the deterioration of relations with Russia. And also this should be addressed if we want a peaceful solution and lasting peace. The origins of this geopolitical battle between the United States and Russia date back to right after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. And this is because of the post-Cold War geopolitical objective of the United States, as has been formulated in the Wolfowitz Doctrine, to remain the leading power and preventing the rise of rival powers. And so this is the way the US, for example, pushed into moving the NATO closer to the Russian borders in several stages of expansion. Don't forget also at the same time, NATO turned into an organization acting outside the territory with military interventions in Bosnia and Serbia, even if Russia protested, although it was greatly weakened under Yeltsin. So I'm talking now about the 90s. So when Putin came to power, he first sought to establish good relations. With his war in Chechnya, he saw himself as an ally of the US and NATO because of their war on terror in Afghanistan. But the US stick to its superpower policy. And I just give a few examples how they made relations with Russia bad. So they canceled the ABM treaty already in 2002. 2 years later, US waged a war of aggression against Iraq. In 2007, it was working on a NATO missile shield in Romania and Poland, and so forth and so forth. And there were and of course, last but not least, the candidate status to Ukraine and Georgia to become NATO member at the NATO summit in Bucharest. And this was, I must emphasize, at the time against the wishes of France and Germany and also my country. So several European NATO allies were against it because they saw it as a breach of a certain security of the security situation in Europe. NATO membership, for example, of Ukraine would mean, among other things, that Russia would have to give up its military presence, which was on the basis of an agreement at the time in Ukraine, in the strategically important Crimea, and would have to share a long border with the military rival. Within Moscow's broad political spectrum, such an expansion into former Soviet territory was an absolute red line, and everybody knew it. And I just want to quote, but for sure you know, a confidential memo leaked in WikiLeaks dated before the Bucharest summit, the 1st of February 2008, by US Ambassador in Moscow, William Burns, who wrote, and I quote him, "Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst, civil war. In that, eventually, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia doesn't want to have to face." These were the words of Burns, the 1st of February 2008, on the eve of admission of Ukraine as future NATO member. Nevertheless, at Washington's instigation, the relationship between NATO and Ukraine has been developed, and we know that with all kinds of military programs and so I don't want to go deeper into that. So it was a very deliberately confrontational policy, and where we have the consequences now in Europe years later of that. And European allies accepted that relations with their large European neighbor were deteriorating, which helped pushing the Kremlin towards a more nationalistic and militaristic path. And NATO's first Secretary General Lord Ismay explained NATO's purpose in the early 50s already to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And it's no different today. NATO must serve American interests in Europe. The US has been pursuing a policy of countering Russian gas supplies to Europe for some time, as it has growing gas export capacity itself. And through economic warfare with sanctions and counter-sanctions, they have managed to increase their own gas supplies to Europe. I don't want to talk about the destruction of Nord Stream pipeline, which is not clear who was the responsible for it, but we know that it serves future gas interests of the United States. So I think, and now to come to the part of the dangerous policy, what is happening now in Ukraine and why the war has to be stopped? Well, we have seen this with the missile strike last year in Poland, which with the great potential for dangerous escalation, it showed it. The policy of the US and some NATO countries is to weaken Russia by providing weapons and intelligence, but this military strategy prolongs the war and increases the human and material suffering and is not in the interest of Ukraine. Every day that the war continues, young men die on the front lines, civilians suffer violence and destruction, and that's why the war must stop and end as soon as possible, because the killing and destruction must stop. The war is also taking its toll outside Ukraine, economic warfare and war profiting by multinational energy and food companies, and so these are all the consequences. People kill hunger and poverty worldwide because of increased food prices. President Putin, and this is very important, I think, is often compared to Hitler with the related argument that it was a military defeat that ended his tyranny. And this is also an argument that has often been used by the left in Europe. But
Ludo, about 2 minutes. You got about 2 minutes to go.
Okay,
here.
I will finish. I'm almost there. There is at least one important difference. Hitler didn't have nuclear weapons. And if Russia is backed into a corner and the Kremlin is offered no political way out, what guarantee do we have that nuclear weapons will not be used? Above all, military humiliations could lead to the destabilization of the Russian Federation and the nuclear arsenal falling into the wrong hands. So, my final part, and then I will stop. I think it's 1 minute, Joseph, or 1.5 minutes. An end of the war into just and lasting peace, both just and lasting peace, must take into account the following principles, according to me. The root causes of the war that broke out, as I explained before, as a nationalist war in 2014 must be addressed. The question is it still possible to return to the Minsk agreements? And this means the idea of some kind of autonomy of certain regions in Ukraine. I don't know. This is a very difficult issue to tackle, but it would be good if we could return to that. This is, of course, very difficult seeing the positions of both sides. Secondly, Russia must respect Ukrainians' sovereignty. And on the other hand, I think Ukraine should have a neutral status with international guarantees, better guarantees. And again, also membership of military alliances should not be considered as a sovereign right when it affects security interests of other countries. 3, an end to measures that fuel or escalate the war, like certain arm deliveries, sanctions, unilateral annexations. This is all fueling and escalating the war. 4, respect. This is a universal principle for human rights, minority rights, and justice for victims. 5, a new European security architecture that respects mutual security concerns, different than what we had until now. 6, demilitarization and denuclearization of Europe. Dissolved or suspended treaties and agreements should as soon as possible be reactivated on conventional forces, the missile shield, INF, open treaty, new start, but also new disarmament agreements will be needed on nuclear sharing, or I refer to what happened now with Belarus, and Russia missiles probably will be deployed there. And also the European nuclear-free zone as far as the Urals should be something we have to aim for. Then 7, investment in human security and a commitment to address planetary life-threatening problems as climate change and environmental destruction, poverty, nuclear arms, as an absolute priority for humankind. Parties need to accept that war is an obstacle for addressing these problems while they turn urgent. And last, and this is what Reiner already said, we have other powers, rising powers in the world, differently from the policies in the West and also from Russia. But China's 12-point peace plan, I think, may be vague and not condemning Russian aggression. But since it's based on principles of international law, they refer to sovereignty, territorial integrity, urges a ceasefire, opposes nuclear threats, among others, it can serve as a framework for a more elaborate negotiation agenda. And in any case, Western attacks on this Chinese plan are an expression of a new Cold War mentality and not productive. So I think we should use this 12-point plan and maybe change it or adapt it and discuss on that and see it as a way to finish this war. I thank you. Sorry for taking my time.
Ludo, thank you very much. And thank you for your conclusion with a number of possible positive approaches to moving toward not only ending the war, but dealing with other crises that are existential crises that face us. I'm going to turn the floor now over to Phyllis Bennis. Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you to the earlier speakers. Thanks to all the organizers, Cole, and everyone. It's very good that we're talking about this between US and Europeans. Ultimately, this discussion needs to be global because the impact of this war is a global impact. And the global situation, as we know, is very complicated, not only because of this war. There are other wars still underway. There is massive inequality on the rise. Poverty is on the rise. The climate crisis is on the rise, and the resulting refugee crises are on the rise everywhere. Authoritarianism is on the rise. So the war of Ukraine, which is at the centerpiece of all of this, has to look into the consequences between this war and the global threats that are being escalated and caused by this war. I think that one thing that's important for us to look at in understanding both the history and the current crisis of the war in Ukraine is the notion, as my old friend Richard Falk puts it, that there are really two wars. They are certainly related, but they are also separate. There's the long-standing geopolitical war between Russia and the United States and NATO, in which the US is very much the aggressor. This is a war that's been going on for decades, starting, as Ludo said, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and the consequences of that are playing out now. There is also an on-the-ground war that did begin in a different way. There's not to say that there was not fighting going on inside Ukraine, but the direct invasion of Russia last February does change those situations, and it makes that on-the-ground war in which Russia was the aggressor, unlike the earlier war where the US was the aggressor, the more immediate one, both because of the global consequences, because of the incredibly high level of casualties, human casualties, and the destruction of the country that is underway right now, and crucially, the threat of an escalation to a nuclear exchange. For all of those reasons, that's the part of this two-part war that we are paying attention to right now. And I think that urgency is appropriate for us to recognize. It is different when there is an invasion across borders. It means that we need to not only condemn that action, which we certainly do, but also call for it to end. I think one of the problems we face in the United States in the divide within our own peace movement is a reluctance amongst many in the peace movement. I'm sorry to say, it's not just few or not just some, it's a lot of people are very reluctant, even though they are critical of the Russian invasion. They're critical to call on Russia to withdraw. They're reluctant to hold Russia accountable for any of this because of the long history of US provocations. And in that context, I think it's important that we recognize that there's a difference between those kinds of points of principle and the kinds of strategies that we need to respond to them. So, for example, on the one hand, you hear very often people saying, Ukraine has the right of self-determination. That's absolutely right. And that doesn't tell us what the strategy should be to reclaim that right. It doesn't mean, in my view, that any weapons that Ukraine asks for should be given by the United States, because rights like the right of self-determination don't exist in the abstract. They exist in the real world. And how we fight for those rights have consequences on a daily basis that lead to the death of far more people than is acceptable. So that's one way to look at it. On the other side, we hear calls that Well, we shouldn't really be talking about what Russia's doing because the U.S. has been provoking Russia for decades. NATO has been provoking Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's true, and that doesn't give Russia the right to violate Ukraine's right of self-determination. So recognizing the rights and recognizing the principles isn't enough to tell us what the strategies have to be. And the strategies have to be based on what are the consequences of this war continuing. We've heard some of that already. But I think as we look at it, we have to look at these consequences, the militarization of Europe, the rise of global hunger, including absolute famine in a number of countries as a result of the lack of access to once available grain, the environmental catastrophe that's resulting from the escalation in demand for new sources of fossil fuel, and crucially, the possibility of a nuclear exchange. We can't explain that too much. And it's not enough to say, as I think some people do, well, the chances are really very small. I happen to think that's true. I don't think either side intends to launch nuclear weapons. Both sides have threatened. Russia has threatened verbally and now is threatening to move nuclear weapons into Belarus. The US has threatened it by its escalation of what they call modernization, the new decision to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years in modernizing the nuclear arsenal. Both of those represent illegal threats of nuclear weapons, and they both must be condemned. And we have to recognize that anything other than zero is simply too big a threat when we're talking about a nuclear exchange. So saying that it's really unlikely, to my mind, is not sufficient to say that that should not be determinative of our strategy. So part of what I think we have to deal with here, and both Ludo and Reiner mentioned this, is the question of education in the peace movement. But it's not enough, I'm afraid, to talk about the history. The history that Ludo just ran through was a terrific history, a short version of these complicated histories on both sides. And all of that, we should be trying to broaden that, to make that accessible to a lot more people in our movement and people who look to our movement as potentially a way of coming to see this war in a slightly different way. But at the same time, it's not enough to look at the history. We also have to think about how do we get countries to move in this direction? We know that there are countries in the global south. Brazil is one, South Africa is one. Other countries, China has taken the lead. Turkey, Israel, these are not all countries that we want in the leadership of this. We should be very clear. I worry a great deal about any negotiations that are led by Turkey and Israel, an apartheid state and an increasingly authoritarian state. That's not my idea of who should be organizing this. The United Nations is where these negotiations should be, but we all know how insufficient the United Nations these days is to play that role globally. So the question of how we do that education has to go broader than the history to include this whole question of strategy and how we identify it. For example, when we talk about the issue of refugees, and this point that Ludo made is crucially important, that we have to be calling for the welcoming of all refugees on all sides. That means we also have the obligation to recognize and call out the kind of racism and double standards that we have seen in how the refugees of Ukraine have been welcomed. Overwhelmingly, Ukrainians have been welcomed in every country where they have shown up exactly as all refugees should be welcomed, with warm clothes and hot soup and toys for the children and a promise of a place to stay and a job and not have to worry about being sent back to a war zone. That's how every refugee should be greeted. And we know that not every refugee from Ukraine was greeted that way, that African students and Indian doctors were not welcomed in that way, were not allowed onto the trains. And we know that all the other refugees around the world, whether they be Afghan, Palestinian, whether they be Somali, or wherever they are from, are not greeted that way. So
I've got to give you a 2-minute warning here.
Okay, that is not only something that we need to call out, but we need to use it as a model. Ukraine proved that you can take in millions of people in small numbers of countries, and those countries will not collapse. They can do that. So that's part of what our education needs to look like. So when we talk about diplomacy, we need to call for both bilateral diplomacy between our own government in the United States and Russia, which is separate from the negotiations over what it will look like for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. The US has no business telling the Ukrainians what they should give in, what they should concede. But the US that is providing now $113 billion so far in aid to Ukraine, of which $66 billion has been direct military aid, weapons of all sorts, not to even speak of the billions that are coming in from NATO countries in Europe. Given that, the US has not only the right, but the obligation to call for negotiations and a ceasefire, not to say what the results of those negotiations should look like, what Ukraine must do, but that there must be negotiations. And I think we have to separate, we have to call for separate US negotiations with Russia, including on getting back into nuclear agreements to restart New START and go back to a period where there could be some safety, some prevention of nuclear annihilation, which we're really looking at as a potential threat here, and things that are still going on with provocations. The establishment of a new military base by the US on the Polish border, less than 100 miles from the Russian border. All of these are things that we have to look at for what our own country should be talking about with Russia. Then it's separate from what the negotiations need to be, which must be global, the negotiations that will lead to an end to this war. We have no choice, given the impact of this war on the global South, on the poor people of the world, across the world, who are suffering from this, as well as the people who are dying in Ukraine, the soldiers who are being conscripted in Russia, the anti-war movements that are being suppressed all around the world. This is our obligation as a movement, and we have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Phyllis, thank you. Thank you very much for a really broad analysis and linking the necessity of U.S.-Russian and global negotiations. I'm going to see if either of the three of you want to ask one another questions for clarification or to push back before we open to Q&A. Any?
I'd say let's go to Q&A.
Okay, Q&A. All right. Well, I've been trying to keep track. I just see 7 new messages came in. So the challenge of tracking what people are saying and following the messages. So maybe one question would be to Phyllis in terms of how you see getting to the United Nations playing a more significant role in actual negotiations.
Yeah, that's a huge question. And there's not, I think, a single easy answer. I think the first thing that has to happen is some acknowledgement by the United States that they are not in charge, and that being in charge does not mean simply providing weapons. We still have to keep up the pressure on getting a US acknowledgement that negotiations and a ceasefire are crucial and necessary and urgent, not just an abstraction for the future, but urgent. And I think in that context, one of the things that we have to be looking at is this issue of how we can change opinions in the mainstream press, among members of Congress, all of whom right now are not only leading in a very pro-war approach, but those who are having second thoughts about all that are too frightened to raise it. We saw a few months ago when progressives in Congress wrote a very mild call to the White House, to the Biden administration, urging a call for negotiations, not saying we should stop sending weapons, not saying we should stop sending military aid, simply saying we should add a call for negotiations. And the pushback was so fierce that when the letter was immediately withdrawn, since that time, the most progressive members of Congress have been largely reluctant to speak out, even on their own, let alone in a collective way, to call for a ceasefire. So we have to be the ones who will have their back, who will protect them and make that something that is not something that is seen as political suicide. Then we can be talking about what can those negotiations look like. I agree with Ludo that the Chinese 12-point proposal has some basis in international law. I don't think it's a viable framework as it is I think it's a very crucial thing that's left out quite consciously by the Chinese, which is a recognition that Russia is deliberately violating international law and must withdraw its troops. The failure to say that means it's not going to go anywhere. Other aspects of it certainly could be, but calling for an acceptance of the Chinese proposal as the beginning of a negotiating proposal, I'm afraid has passed. I don't think that would work. But I do think for those of us in the United States, and it is ultimately US money and US weapons that are the most responsible for perpetuating this war, I think our goal has to be the first goal of getting on the agenda the legitimacy of an urgent call for a ceasefire and negotiations. And just one quick point, and then I'll leave it to my colleagues. The quick point is the US has a long and really terrible history of directly and openly opposing ceasefire calls. It's done it in the UN over and over and over again, usually when it's an Israeli assault on Gaza, where we've seen it blatant and horrific, that the language of Condoleezza Rice and others, we don't need a ceasefire yet. That's what President Biden said about Ukraine. We don't need a ceasefire yet. Our job is to persuade a majority of people in our country they're wrong, that we need a ceasefire now. We needed a ceasefire on the day of the invasion, and we need a ceasefire now.
So thank you, Phyllis. That sort of leads me to moving toward looking at this question here, which is certainly in the United States, and I expect also in Europe, there's criticism of the call for a ceasefire, saying it would lead.
Let me say 2 sentences to the United Nations. I think the UN can play a role in this whole process of coming to peace. It can play a role in continuing the deals they made up to now, the drain deal, and also in the humanitarian consequences and the exchange of captured soldiers. So on the humanitarian way, they can play an important role. And I think they also can play an important role in the reconstruction and redevelopment of the country. It's a totally destroyed country, which must be reconstructed. And don't believe that the US and Europe will rebuild the country. These countries will be alone when the imperial countries reach their goals. So I think there is an important role of the UN, also as an instrument for exchange and discussion. So that is my position to the role. I think we should be very careful to minimalize the role of the United Nations, even when we all know that the main role by the negotiation will not be played by the United Nations because of the power structure of the world. And for me, these Chinese suggest it is not a peace plan, and they never called it peace plan. They called it suggestions for peace development in Ukraine. And I think this is the right words because it shows some background on which ground negotiations could be developed. Sovereignty, discussion of a new peace order, accept the situation and the security interests of all sides. I think these are backstones for the negotiations. And I'm very happy that no one starts developing a peace plan, because the peace plan will be a crucial point which has to be developed in serious discussion and talks. And there will be a lot of compromises and a lot of problems which were coming up. What will be with Donbass and Lugansk, which are now officially a part of Russia? We have to find a solution for this problem. And this is not be easier. Maybe we have to find a solution for the next years and then again have a people's vote in this area. So that is a part for me for the discussion. And it is open. The key point, and I'm absolutely on the side of my colleagues, is that we really get ceasefire as the first step and get the parties at the negotiation table. And which parties? I'm very open. When I mentioned Israel and Turkey, I was not mentioning them because I'm positive to the governments. I mentioned them because they are playing a role in finding ways to peace. And that is for me a positive sense. Not all the countries I'm not a big friend of the Chinese government, it's much authoritarian for me, but they play an important role in this negotiation process. And I think we have to take this in mind and to support the positive elements.
Just to say,
Joseph, just in two sentences,
course.
maybe, just to add and to comment, because I think, unfortunately, the international architecture order, let's say, is what we witness is a kind of erosion of it. Yeah, and I hope we will reestablish it in somehow. Two important countries that are deeply involved in this war are Russia and United States, and they're permanent members of the Security Council. So that's why the UN or United Nations is in a very difficult position to take a lead or a leading role in having negotiations. But if you look to the history of starting peace negotiations among countries that are at war, often there is some individual or a small group of countries that took the initiative to put forward a peace plan, to behind the curtains, to have negotiations and to see what are the positions of each of them. And I think that's why I think negotiations, or let's say the start of negotiations, we should look to those powers. And the Chinese proposal, China could be in this position together with other countries like Brazil to take a lead, and not too openly, maybe, behind the curtains, because they have, especially China, they have a kind of economical and political weight towards Russia, and they could play this role if they wouldn't have been discredited that much by the West in that sense. And that's a problem, because China is like the next on the list from the West scene, in the sense that they could be on Taiwan the next war, or the next friction between China could be between China and the West. But I think the Chinese plan is based on principles, and these principles are very important. And it's from these principles that you can go to concrete negotiations items, and this is what can be done by individual countries. And then the United Nations can play a role in let's say, bringing it onto the right path and bringing it into resolutions, and so that it to have the support of the rest of the international community, let's say.
Thank you. I want to go back to kind of a question that's often asked here, which is essentially, wouldn't imposition of a ceasefire before negotiations basically leave forces in place, leave the Russian aggression successful, and therefore that in opposition to ceasefire? It's a very common question here, and a rationale for continuing the war. You could respond to that.
Ceasefire does not mean to accept the invasion. Ceasefire does not mean to accept the actual situation where the troops are staying. Ceasefire only means the stop of the day-to-day killing and destroying of the country, and open the door for finding solutions for a new peace architecture in the country and in Europe. There will be no single peace solution only for Ukraine. It must combine with the development of a new peace architecture in Europe. Otherwise, it will not work. It must combine with negotiation for arms control, above all nuclear. It must combine with a new discussion of the demilitarization of the area between Russia and Europe. So this is a long process, and the start of this process is ceasefire, which opens the door for negotiations.
I would just add to that.
I think totally. Yeah.
Go ahead, Luda.
Just short. I agree totally with that. I mean, ceasefire doesn't put forward kind of proposal for a solution, political solution. Most wars start with a ceasefire, and ceasefire is necessary to create space for negotiations. First ceasefire, then negotiations. That's the logic, I think. And ceasefire is, like as Reiner said, it's not at all admitting or giving in to one or the other party. It's just agreeing on the fact that if we want a political solution, we need first to stop the war. Yeah, and we have we need the ceasefire and stop the killing. That's the first thing we need before negotiations can go ahead.
I think that's absolutely right, what both Ludo and Reiner said. I would just point to the claim that's made in the US, which is true, that one or both sides, usually the claim is made that it will be Russia, will violate the ceasefire. And the answer is, I think we can't prove that both sides will agree to it and both sides will implement it, but we have to try. We have to try. There are examples in history, including in US history, where negotiations went on without a ceasefire, Vietnam being one. Beginning in 1968 and then taking a new initiative after the Christmas bombing in 1972. So for 3 more years, there was death and destruction of an enormous sort across Vietnam. And the question is that your preference? When anybody says that, do you prefer that the war go on while negotiations happen? No, the preference should be stop the war and begin these negotiations and fight for it to be kept up. That's all we can do.
Phyllis took the line that on the Ukrainian side, we have 900,000 soldiers from 16 years boys to over 16-year-old men now. And the Russian has about now 650,000. And they have a reserve by 2.5 million. Should they all go to this war when the war continues? So to stop these day-to-day killing, that is absolutely needed for ceasefire. And then we can see what's happened. And, you know, Vietnam is the best example. How good it would be when we had a ceasefire in Vietnam in '69. How many people could survive? How many destroyment of the country would not happen? So I think ceasefire is obviously, it does never mean to accept the actual political and geographical situation.
So I'm going to come in with a question of my own here. I know there are a number of here I'm trying to keep track in the chat. But, you know, in many ways, this war has not been about Ukraine. It's been about the structure of power in Europe. It's been about the post-Cold War balance of power, imbalance of power, and advantage. And I guess my question is, how do you see both creation of a process toward creating a new and reasonably just European security architecture or Euro-Atlantic security architecture, and what might it include? Because it seems to me that's a big part of getting to negotiations, getting at least to some understandings about what Europe's going to look like in the future.
You know,
Can I just say, I think that that's not necessarily the starting point. Because I think this is what I think the notion of what I said at the beginning about this being 2 wars or 2 parts of one war is important, because the urgency is to stop the military war that is now being fought. And that is something that ultimately is going to involve negotiations between 2 parties, Russia and Ukraine. Clearly, Ukraine is backed by NATO, the US, the rest of Europe, etc. And the broad issue of a new security architecture, one that is not grounded in military, but is grounded in environmental concerns, in human rights and all of that, that's a very big issue. And I don't think that we should hold hostage the negotiations to end the military war in Ukraine right now to that ultimate goal. So I think we do have to separate periods of what negotiations will look like.
But I think, Phyllis, that, you know, if we want to have Russia at the negotiations table and to have commitments to whatever, then you also need to give Russia a perspective of what it will be treated for in the future, in the near future. I mean, as long as the NATO is behaving as it has been since the end of the Cold War, I think this is not encouraging Russia to give in on the negotiation table, whatever it is. So, you know, you have to address all layers of the conflict, and you can make of all those layers of conflict, you know, if you involve all layers of conflict into at the negotiation table, then you can have a package deal. And I think, so in my view, this means also you have to address it, the security system. What is the perspective for Russia in the future in Europe? How will the security system look like? Will it be as it is now, with an expanding NATO, you know, with a long border from Finland now up to Ukraine, like, you know, as a NATO border which is for Russia not a very nice perspective in having what they see as an adversary, as a direct military neighbor. No, and then I think it's about what Joseph was talking about in his question about a future security architecture. And then I think immediately about what happened in the 70s, the Helsinki process. This was a process of building trust among the East and the West at that time. And this process was very, very helpful in having agreements on disarmament, especially nuclear disarmament. Don't forget, in that time, there have been 70, 80,000 nuclear arms around the world, which was an unbelievable destructive power, which represented that. And so it helped, let's say, decreasing somehow this danger coming out of these nuclear arms. So I think it's a package deal, it's not first this and this. You just need to give all parties involved perspectives for their future as what they see as, very important issues to tackle.
Can I just say, I think that's true. And what's also true is that the US and Russia are going to need to take up many of these issues immediately. But that I don't think is going to be on the table when Russia and Ukraine meet. I think that's where there's a distinction. I agree with you. These are crucial issues that ultimately is the only way that there's going to be anything remotely resembling a stable, peaceful Europe.
I think
Go ahead, Reiner. I've been watching the gears in your brain turn.
I think the first steps, what we need is to start again with trust building. We have such a deep mistrust between Russia and the European Union and the NATO countries that trust building, which was the beginning also of the cooperation in the 70s, that there were channels where people were speaking with each other and develop first suggestions where they could agree and where they don't agree. And this trust building process will be a start process which we need again. And I think there are no walls between negotiations and ceasefire negotiation of Ukraine and other parts of negotiations. We definitely need the arms control negotiation on the nuclear field. Above all, what are we doing with the New START? And what are we doing with all this modernization of nuclear weapons on both sides? And we also need these multilateral negotiations because we will have the questions of security guarantees. And security guarantees must come from other countries, which will include NATO countries, which will include the US, which will include also the United Nations. So other parts will be engaged in the whole process. If this will be immediately in the beginning or in the ongoing process of after the start of the negotiation, this is for me an open question that we will see. But there will be no solution of the Ukrainian war without opening the door for developing a new peace architecture. It will definitely take a long time. It will be not very quick. And my hope is when it will be positive, that we will come to these negotiations, maybe in the summer or autumn time, that we can have first agreements for a new peace architecture till 2025, when we have the 50th anniversary of Helsinki, and have then a revitalization of the thoughts and ideas of Helsinki.
So having touched here on the need for nuclear disarmament, we have a question, and I've certainly been involved in discussions here in the U.S. peace movement about how much we should be raising the possibility of nuclear war as a center part of our campaigning for ceasefire negotiations. How seriously do you take the danger of the war escalating to the nuclear level?
I take it very, very, very serious, and that's why I think it should, as soon as for me, it's the most important argument, a part of the killings in Ukraine itself, why the war should stop as soon as possible, because now we see this war, an enormous potential in escalating, as we have seen since before the war. Then the war started, the invasion of Russia, and then you see all the time escalation, as a doomsday clock we are familiar with. this panel of scientists that estimated that we never have been so close to the threat of war. And I think many people familiar with the nuclear arms and arms race and destructive power of it think the same. And so that's why it should be addressed. And that's why I think when I look to Europe, and even in the peace movement, the discussions that, starting from the position that Ukraine has the right to defend and it must regain all its territory. Okay, you can have this illusion, but I think we're going into the stalemate of war at the best. But at the same time, as long as this war continues from this kind of right of defending and especially right of reconquering the whole of Ukraine, then we are very close to a use of nuclear arms by Russia. I'd say we think all that Putin is crazy, and if I talk with this security people in Belgium, the specialists, they say, but Putin never will be so crazy that he will use nuclear arms. Well, this is like, I don't want to make too much confidence on that. Very simple,
I don't think the issue is Putin crazy or not. I actually don't think that either Putin or Biden are likely to order nuclear weapons to be fired. The problem is escalation in wars happen and they get out of control of the people who think they're running the wars. And the notion, one of the things that we don't see in Ukraine that we did see, for example, in Syria, where the US and Russia were supporting opposite sides. It was much more of a proxy war, less direct, but both had soldiers on the ground in that war, and and both had planes in the air. They had a military to military hotline that meant that when there was a mistake, when some young soldier got up and saw a flare and thought, oh my God, we're under attack, I better fire back, somebody could call immediately and say, pull back, this was an accident, this is not an escalation. When somebody on one side or the other planned a bombing, they called the other side and said, get your people out of there, we don't want to kill your people. Neither side, we should be clear, neither the Russians nor the Americans cared about killing Syrians. But both of them were very concerned about killing each other. And they don't have that in Ukraine. And the danger is enormous, because anytime you're talking about nuclear weapons, if it's not zero, it's too big. It can be tiny, and I think it is tiny. But that's too big a risk for the world, because we're talking about the potential of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, but it's not only the deliberate use of nuclear weapons, it's especially in this situation, the misunderstandings that come out, or the miscommunications that are dangerous. The idea that, they are attacking us, and then they behaving as they were attacked, and they use their nuclear arms, as we have already had such incidents in the past. So this is the most dangerous thing, I think.
And we can see the escalation. Britain will send depleted uranium to Ukraine. Depleted uranium is not nuclear weapons, but it's radioactive. And we know the consequences of nuclear depleted uranium. On the other side, the Russians are sending their nukes now to Belarus. And Belarus is very near to the Polish border and to the Finnish border. So we come nearer and nearer. And next year, the modernization of the B-6112 starts in Western Europe. These are very modern, technically high developed nuclear weapons. We have the missile defense system, which you immediately can change from conventional forces to nuclear forces, which is not technologically a big problem. So when there is no trust between the both sides and no communication, the danger of the escalation is absolutely high. So I think we should do everything to bring the nuclear dimension on the agenda and to develop the activities of the peace movement for the denuclearization of Europe. Lula mentioned nuclear weapon-free zone. We have to discuss about that more countries sign the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and. I think it is a really very important question, and I don't know if Ludi agree. I think even in the European peace movement, many of our friends and colleagues are not paying enough attention to the nuclear dimension of the danger.
I'll just add one thing here. I think it's unlikely that Ukrainian forces are going to be in a position to try to take over Crimea. But in conversations I've had with senior Russian figures, including military figures, what they say is that if Crimea becomes, if Russian control of Crimea moves to be in question, at that point, all bets are off. So I think that's something we need to think about. I want to try to combine two questions here. We have a question from Steiner Bryn in Norway, essentially asking, basically saying, as you have more deaths on all sides, more sense of loss, the sense of needing to continue fighting so that the sacrifices will not have been in vain becomes greater. And he's asking what is necessary to create a will toward engage in negotiations. And I guess a related question is whether we can expect Ukraine to engage in negotiations with Russia as long as there's no commitment to withdraw its forces. We've lost Reiner here, but I hope he will be able to get back in. Ludo, Phyllis?
Well, I think we partly discussed this already. I think how to create will for negotiations on both sides. Well, after ceasefire, maybe there will be this political space. I just see one mechanism, and that is that parties are maybe encouraged to continue the war. As long as we give the signal. Now, I talk from our side, let's say our side, by saying we send more and more weapons, more and more heavier weapons, maybe soon fighter jets. And so, well, this is not encouraging Russia to get to the negotiation table, because as it has done now, up to now, it is responding with harsher talks, like now the deployment of missiles in Belarus soon. Well, this is, and so it should discourage. So I don't know. So there should be, for example, on the side of Ukraine, the policy of, okay, we send weapons because you have the right to defend. This could be a position, and at the same time, but with the purpose of creating, positions that are like now, for example, that we can have negotiations, because we all say Ukraine has the right to defend when the situation is there to have negotiations. But it's easy, when we're giving the weapons to them. If you stop weapon delivery, then Ukraine has not the choice, let's say. So I think this is important. I think we should discourage, or not encourage, parties to continue the war. And there are many mechanisms to do that. We can also start with to the Russians. We take away these and these sanctions. For example, I just say something. And in order, if you do this movement,
this is exactly, this is exactly right.
Encouraging parties to go to the negotiation table.
What the U.S. and its allies have done has been to send all the messages to Ukraine that we will support any level of warfare for as long as you want to fight. We will fight to the last Ukrainian, is essentially their attitude. And I think it's important, one, that there be this kind of clarifying. We've seen this in Iraq, we've seen it elsewhere, where U.S. sanctions were imposed initially on the grounds of persuading a government to change its actions. We know that never works. The governments protect themselves, and it's the people who feel the effect of sanctions. In this situation, like in Iraq, we're dealing with an objective conditions where people in Russia could be saying, doesn't matter what we do, they're never going to lift these sanctions. Why do I say that? It's because they said that in Iraq. When Saddam Hussein at one point said that he would allow all the inspectors in, they were jostling over numbers of inspectors. And the answer was, we don't care what you do now, the sanctions are going to remain. There needs to be a clarification from the US, of course, that sanctions will be lifted as soon as a ceasefire is in place. We also have to recognize that it's not just the symbolism of the weapons going, there's direct diplomatic initiatives going, as we saw with the UK former prime minister being sent off as representative of the West to tell Ukraine, You don't have to negotiate. You don't have to stop fighting. We're here for you as long as you want to be. I do think it's important that we not take too seriously the polls that we hear about that say 80%, 85% of Ukrainians will fight to the last person to save their country. I'm sure there are Ukrainians who believe exactly that. But I'm also very confident that there are people who just want to say, I just want my children to be safe. I just want the war to be over. And if that means we have to adjust where our southern border is, I'm willing to do that. That we can't make that judgment. But I don't believe that there are not tons of people in that country that are prepared to say exactly that, but are not willing to say it publicly because there's too much public pressure not to. So we don't know what the people of Ukraine want. We do know what their government is imposing with the help of the United States and NATO. The same is true in Russia. The repression obviously is more overt and known, but there's plenty of that kind of public repression, if you will, in Ukraine. On the Russian side, there is opposition. It doesn't have much opportunity to be seen and heard, but it's clearly there. And as more and more body bags keep coming back, the effort to underplay the number of casualties is going to fall apart, and more people will get it, and there will be more opposition. So I think that we have to recognize that people in Ukraine or Russia, like anywhere else, are concerned with protecting their families, protecting their children, not sending their children off to a war that makes no sense. So I think that talking about that exactly like this is a crucial part of how we go about changing that discourse.
We have a lot of questions here, and there's one I want to be sure we get to, so I'm going to jump to it now. The question is, what can NGOs, non-governmental organizations, actually do to move governments toward the negotiations that we needed? What can different groups, be it Rotary, be it Peace Action, what can they do?
You know, there are these two levels from my understanding. First of all, the most important thing is we need more actions on the street. We have to mobilize more people than in the past for negotiations and ceasefire. That is definitely what all peace groups can do in the local community and in the region and national-wide. But I think there is also the possibility to show by letters and by speeches and by lobbying that more and more people want ceasefire negotiations, to contact your parliamentarians, to contact the politicians, to say, you know, this is the people's mean, and we don't want to continue the war like Phyllis was describing it. I think the anti-war atmosphere in all countries is growing, also in our countries, because also our government is saying, oh, the majority is supporting our politics. Even the polls say the opposition to that. So we have really a chance in education, in action, and in lobbying. I think these are the 3 points for a strategy, and every peace group and every civil society organization can take one or two of these and do something.
But at the same time, we have to admit, and I think time will change that, but you know, up to now, the capacity of the peace movement to mobilize, to take the streets, as Reiner says and proposes, as we did, is not very big. You know, it's not, you cannot compare it with what happened before the war, Iraq war. So the U.S. attacked against Iraq. You know, it caused a spontaneous movement, and I don't know why. There are many reasons why it's not that way now. Maybe there's confusion. There is, you know, there's much of discussion inside the peace movement as well. And I think, and there I follow Reiner. I think that's why we have to continue this work, in informational work. You know, to give context, to give background, to show people that there are alternatives. And more people will see, and you see it now in the political world, that this war cannot endlessly going on. You know, the costs are too big, not only human costs, you know, in lives of people on the war front, but also economical and political costs that come out of that. You know, the rise of extreme right parties, you know, this kind of stuff. And so maybe this can change the atmosphere. And, you know, because there was also a question about the media, you know, as a peace movement, the narrative of the peace movement is almost not present. And although we are continuing to share our views, to push them to publish our open ads and so. But it's kind of blocking us, and this hopefully will change in time when they see themselves that this war cannot endlessly going on. And then we have the space to inform, to mobilize people, and to have also the space in media, where our messages are distributed, because now it's very, very difficult. But I see it changing, and I hope I'm right.
I think this change is going on in the US as well. It's very, very difficult. We don't have much access to the mainstream press for sure. And our movement is divided. We have to face that. Our movement is divided even over basic questions about should we be supporting the US sending weapons? There are people saying, yes, we should. And so we have work to do within our movements. I think that the education part and the support of the kind of human anti-war sentiment that is out there needs to be a big part of what we are working on. The protests in the street, I think we have to be careful, because the question comes, what are we demonstrating? Are we demonstrating strength, or are we demonstrating weakness in the streets? And so it's not always, that's a tactical question. It's not a strategic question. Do we go into the streets or not? And if we don't, we're not really anti-war. Of course we are. There are many things we need to do. And the collaboration across the Atlantic, the global collaboration with the global South, these are all crucial components of that work that we have ahead. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. None of it is easy, because we're facing not only the lack of discussion, for example, that we faced in some earlier wars, but a massive media and political class assertion of this war as the war of democracy against autocracy. This is the war of good against evil. This isn't just a war over power or who's going to be the hegemon in Europe. This is about good and bad, light and dark. This is existential. And we have to challenge that. We have to break that down so that it becomes less than something that people are afraid of, to say, maybe we shouldn't be sending all these weapons. And it's not because I don't support people in Ukraine. It's because I don't want more of them to die. And think that maybe people will listen to that. Maybe people will listen to that. So I think there is a lot of work ahead, and we're going to have to use every one of the many strategies and many tactics at our disposal, understanding that it's going to be a while yet before we have mass public support. We don't have that yet. And we can't pretend that we do. We have to go out and earn it. We have to go out and raise that support.
So just to say, I'm aware of a coalition of coalitions that next week will be launching appeals for a signature ad campaign here in the United States, with the goal of getting many thousands of signatures, with the setting the timing to lead up to the Vienna Peace Summit. It'd be helpful if Reiner could say a little bit more about his expectations, the goals for the Peace Summit, and so we can think a bit more about how we can do collaboration as it approaches.
First of all, I would like to underline that the times are changing. And I think we have a good chance to mobilize more people and to educate more people than the last month. I think even in the public discussion, in the discussion of the elites, the voices which see that it's impossible only to continue sending weapons is growing. And I think we should use these chance that we hopefully will get more attention also in the so-called the mass media and in the public attention. The situation was, from my understanding, much more worse at the end of the last year than it is now. And, I think every action is great. And Phyllis, I think we both know that in the beginning of the protests against the Vietnam War, we were only also less people, very small group would start protesting. And at the end, it was a quite big crowd. So maybe this is a hope and an illusion, but maybe I personally live with this illusion of this hope that we have the chance to enlarge the number of people. And in Germany, I can absolutely say that we have now bigger protest action. Otherwise, the 50,000 in Berlin would not be possible. What we want to do with the Berlin conference is to bring together the European and international peace movement in a huge coalition with the global South for promoting and fighting for negotiation and peace and ceasefire. And our dream, our goal is to have a Reiner Appeal for negotiation and ceasefire, which we want to distribute to all the parliaments and governments in the world to say, please be active and support the idea of negotiation and ceasefire. And up to now, we have a quite great support from the Global South. We will get a video message from Lula. The vice president of Bolivia is coming. So I hope that we can really show that these new coalition of Global South and the peace movements and peace activists and social movements are possible and can be developed. That is the background of these summit, and it will happen in the early summer, where we hope that the door for negotiations will be even a little bit more open than it is now, because hopefully the belief that the war can be won by military actions will be reduced at that time. So that is a little bit the hope, and we are quite optimistic that we can get a quite interesting event.
So let me reassure our speakers first that we're going to liberate you from the webinar in about 8 minutes. And I kind of hesitate to go back to something unpleasant after those hopeful remarks. But one of the questions here, I'll just put it straight out. The question is, why are so many European governments functioning as lapdogs to American militarism? Why have Europeans accepted, as Lula was quoting the first Secretary General of the United Nations, that NATO should be there to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the U.S. in? Maybe we look to our Europeans to answer that question.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, I can assure you, this is a very frustrating thing, you know. Well, it's the if you see the history, you know, right after the Second World War, it's like that, you know. U.S. has taken the lead, and you know, with the Marshall Plan, they also had arguments, let's say, that we have to follow, something like that. But I think, you know, with the expansion of NATO towards those countries like Poland, the Baltic states, with a total different security concept, you know, with a total different security situation, let's say, with their history, their past, it created a kind of division. And that's why maybe, you know, because from time to time, as I said, you know, before the Bucharest summit, Germany and France didn't agree with the idea of expanding NATO with Ukraine and Georgia. Because they thought it would touch to the security balance system that we have in Europe, we more or less have in Europe. But still, you know, it's like the pressure also from inside Europe to follow this American position is in that way. Europe is divided, you know. We have not this one voice with Poland and countries on the one hand and so. But I don't know, maybe Reiner has another view on that. But you know, I see we are all the time going into the same trap, you know. And as I said, with the gas, you see it very clearly how you know, Germany is subjecting itself to, you know, to this American gas policy. It's very clear that part of this game, this geopolitical game United States is playing on Ukraine, is about the market, the gas market. It's very clear. You can see it in the figures. Gas export to Europe from the United States is doubling every year since 2021, doubling. And Russia is pushed away from the market. Trump already put sanctions on the Nord Stream, those who this act to put sanctions on those who are helping to construction of the Nord Stream. So, and still we are, I don't know, and we are saying that as a peace movement. Some of politicians are saying that, and they ignore it. And it's very difficult to understand why, you know, why they're so stupid to do it.
You know, first of all, this is a discussion for next webinar. because it's absolutely not easy to answer this now in 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. But, you know, I will say maybe a little bit provocative. I think the political elites of the ruling class in Europe made one decision. They want to stay by these huge changes in the world, all these geostrategic changes. They want to stay by economic and political reasons at the side of the United States. This is the background for all the development in Europe, and this is unites Europe, Ludo. This is also unites the position of France and Germany, even with some limits, go to limit side effects, but in general, they are on the same line, like Poland and the others. So,
Yeah,
and
but-
this has
but
to do
Reiner,
with
for
this.
example, I just wanted to very, yeah, but for example, France, you know, there was this before the Russian invasion, there was this European, let's say, policy of a strategic autonomy. You know, President Macron from France was really, it was his, you know, during the presidency of France of the European Union, this was like his big thing.
But
And they
Ludo,
made a strategic compass, you know, they did it in March, and then suddenly it disappeared. Totally.
Ludo,
Can I just
I
add
wanna
one
give-
point about this? Can I just add one point, which is
Go
that
for it.
whatever the intention of the ruling classes across Europe, the actual impact of the war in Ukraine so far, and as we're continuing through it, is going to be not only the militarization of Europe overall, in terms of massive increases in the amounts of money going into military budgets, but also the victory for US military producers, because the theory of NATO is the theory of interoperability, which always means let's buy what the US produces because that's the best. And that's how we will get weapons that we can all use interoperationally. And
You know-
that's an enormous danger of this war. It's one of the reasons, along with all of the others, that this war is such a global disaster in ways that other wars have not been, because one
You
of
know,
the
it is-
is this militarization in Europe.
the politics of
Reiner, the last word
political
here.
elites, the policy of our elites is a political disaster. But for me, Ludo, with the beginning of the war, the strategic fight in the European elites to be more autonomous or be more on the side of the United States is decided. The decision is to be absolutely on the side of the United States. They have a new policy with China. They had a technological agreement with China from autumn last year. It's over. Now they're a part of the strategic competition and the fight on the side of the USA. Not so strong up to now, but absolutely on the side. I think Europe is the biggest loser of this war, and Europe's strategic decision is to be the junior partner of the United States and to accept that, because in general they believe that they will win more when they're on the side of the United States than they will be more or less independent. And don't forget that all big European companies, quite all of the big European countries, have a lot of US influence in these big industrial complexes. Because of the pension funds, Bangkok is sitting everywhere. So these European companies are not any longer European independent companies. They are strongly connected with the United States. This is also a background for this decision to accept the role of junior partner. So this is also the background for me that I'm saying Europe will play no role by developing the ceasefire and negotiations. The role will play other countries, and as peace movement, we have to see that we can come to more common work and more agreement and coalition with these countries which I really want to work for peace and negotiations in Ukraine.
Thank you. So it is 5:30 on the nose. In many ways, it feels like we've begun a discussion. We certainly haven't ended it. As we close, I want to thank our speakers, each of whom brought a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience, and a lot of commitment, and I think ideas as we go forward. And I want to remind our listeners, our participants here, that we don't do this for the fun of it. We have expectations that wherever it is that you live and work, you'll be taking actions and thinking with others about what you can do to stop the war, press the negotiations, and try to create a more just world order in which, among other things, we don't face the dangers of nuclear annihilation and climate annihilation, which requires, among other things, great power cooperation. So thank you very much. Thanks again to our speakers. Thanks to Cole Harrison and Mass Peace Action for anchoring this and for co-sponsoring it. And may everybody work for peace and remain healthy.
Thank you
Good
all.
night.
Thank you very much.